Imagine a place where winter does not arrive quietly. It does not come with the first frost on a windshield, or the gradual shortening of days you barely notice. In the highlands of Afghanistan, winter arrives like a wall. 1 week, you are still moving livestock down from the upper pastures, and the next, the passes are closed. The roads have vanished under 2 meters of snow, and the nearest village is unreachable for months. No resupply, no delivery, no emergency backup plan. Whatever food is inside your home when that wall hits is everything you have until the thaw comes, and the thaw does not come quickly. In some valleys nested inside the Hindu Kush mountain range, that window of total isolation can last 5 months. 5 months during which a family of 8 or 10 people must eat entirely from what they gathered, baked, fermented, dried, and stored before the first snowfall sealed them in. That is the premise. And what you are about to discover is that the people who have survived this cycle for generations did not do it through luck, stubbornness, or sheer endurance. They built one of the most precise and layered food preservation systems ever developed by a highland community, entirely without refrigeration, without electricity, and without any margin for error. What looks like a simple pantry is actually a calculated architecture of biology, physics, and deeply inherited knowledge. And what looks like a humble round of flatbread is the product of a preservation logic so sophisticated that it surprises food scientists when they study it today. If you find yourself drawn to stories of real human ingenuity hiding in places the modern world forgot to look, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter. The challenge begins long before winter. In fact, the families of the Afghan highlands think of food storage not as a winter task, but as a year-round discipline. The harvest season in mid to high-altitude zones of provinces like Badakhshan, Nuristan, Ghor, and Bamyan is brutally short. The growing window at elevations above 2,000 meters can be as narrow as 4 months, sometimes less. Wheat, barley, millet, and legumes must be planted, tended, and harvested in that compressed window. And every grain that falls to the ground wasted is a grain that cannot be eaten in February. This alone shapes the psychology of the entire community around food differently than anything most modern people have experienced. Nothing is thrown away. Nothing is left to chance. The first layer of the system is the grain itself. After harvest, wheat and barley are not simply piled into a room and forgotten. They go through a process that begins on the threshing floor, where the grain is beaten to separate it from the chaff, then tossed repeatedly into the wind so the lighter waste blows away, and only the dense, viable kernels remain. This is not just cleaning. It is selection. Families are choosing grain that is dense, dry, and fully mature, because those are the grains that will last. Grain with even a trace of moisture inside the hull can begin to heat and ferment once stored in quantity. And in an enclosed space over a long winter, a warm pocket of fermenting grain spreads outward like a slow fire, destroying everything it touches. After that initial sorting, the grain is spread on flat rooftops or dry stone surfaces and left to dry further under the intense autumn sun of the highland plateau. Even grain that feels dry to the hand holds internal moisture that must be drawn out before storage. Highland communities in Afghanistan have understood for centuries what modern agronomists confirmed in laboratory studies only recently: that grain stored at even slightly elevated moisture content develops internal fungal growth that is invisible in its early stages and catastrophic in its later ones. The drying process on those rooftops is not cosmetic. It is the first line of defense in a 5-month war against invisible decay. Once the grain is dry enough that it no longer feels cool to the touch even on a cold morning, meaning the moisture has dropped below a threshold the body can detect without instruments, it is moved into storage. And here is where the real architecture begins. Grain storage in the Afghan highlands is not a single room or a single container. It is a system of nested environments, each one calibrated for a different purpose. The primary storage structure is typically built into the home itself, often at ground level or partially below it, where the thermal mass of stone or rammed earth walls keeps the temperature stable. The goal is not cold. The goal is constant. Temperature swings are what destroy stored grain. A space that drops to near freezing at night and warms significantly during the day creates condensation cycles inside the storage vessel. And condensation is the enemy of everything that must last 5 months. A space that holds a steady low temperature, even if that temperature is not dramatically cold, is far more protective than one that oscillates. Grain is loaded into large clay vessels called kumba, sealed wooden chests, or directly into plastered stone alcoves built into the wall. The clay vessel is particularly interesting because of what it does passively. Unglazed clay breathes at a rate that allows tiny amounts of moisture to migrate outward through the vessel walls. This keeps the interior of the vessel slightly drier than the air outside it. In regions where autumn and winter air can still carry humidity, that passive drying effect is a meaningful advantage. The vessel is not just a container. It is an ongoing dehumidifier operating entirely without energy. The grain stored in these vessels is layered with dried aromatic herbs, most commonly wild rue, known locally as saipand, or other pungent mountain plants. For generations, this was explained as tradition or ritual protection. What it actually represents is a biological strategy. The aromatic compounds in these herbs are natural insect and mold inhibitors. In a sealed vessel, the volatile oils released by dried herb material create an atmosphere that is hostile to grain weevils and suppresses certain fungal spores. The herbs do not just smell protective, they are protective. The people who developed this practice did not know the chemistry, but they had observed across hundreds of seasons that grain stored with these materials lasted longer and emerged cleaner in spring. The grain layer is also sometimes covered with a thin layer of wood ash. Ash is alkaline, and an alkaline surface discourages the larvae of grain beetles from establishing at the point where the stored mass meets the air. Again, no laboratory, no degree, just generations of careful observation turned into inherited procedure. But grain is only part of the equation. Bread is the other half, and in Afghan highland communities, the relationship between grain and bread during winter is not what you might expect. They are not simply two forms of the same food. They are two entirely different preservation strategies serving two different roles in the household survival system. Fresh bread, the kind baked each morning in a tandoor oven, is the daily rhythm of life when fuel and labor allow it. But long before winter arrives, women in these households begin producing a different category of bread entirely. This bread is not meant to be eaten the day it is made. It is meant to outlast the season. The most important of these is a form of ultra-dry flatbread that goes through an extended baking process designed not to create a soft, pliable round, but to drive every trace of moisture from the dough. This bread is baked thin, sometimes as thin as a few millimeters, and left in the residual heat of the oven for far longer than regular bread. What comes out is something closer to a hard cracker than a loaf, brittle enough to snap cleanly and so dry that it rings slightly when two pieces are knocked together. The sound of that ring is not accidental. Experienced bakers listen for it as a quality check. A dull thud means moisture remains. A clean ring means the bread is storage ready. This dried bread can last 3 to 4 months without any degradation when stored correctly. It does not mold because there is nothing for mold to grow in. It does not go stale in the conventional sense because it was never soft to begin with. When a family needs to eat it, they do not try to eat it as it is. They break it into pieces and rehydrate it in hot water or broth, and it reconstitutes into something that, while not identical to fresh bread, is nutritious, filling, and deeply familiar in taste. It is, in effect, the original shelf-stable food engineered for a specific climatic challenge. The storage of this dried bread follows its own logic. It is wrapped in cloth or stacked in wooden boxes, placed in the driest part of the house, usually close to the ceiling, in a room that receives some air movement. Heat rises, and the higher zones of a well-insulated room stay drier than the floor level, where cold air and any residual ground moisture tend to collect. The placement of the bread near the ceiling is not arbitrary preference. It is a passive climate strategy built into the routine of every woman who manages one of these households, And if you are starting to sense that this system was designed with a level of precision that goes far beyond basic survival instinct, you are right. What is remarkable about these food storage practices is that they represent not one person's invention, but the accumulated correction of errors across hundreds of generations. Every detail that did not work was quietly abandoned. Every detail that extended shelf life by even a few weeks was kept and passed down. What remains is the distilled result of centuries of field testing in one of the harshest natural testing environments on Earth. That realization tends to change how people see these traditions. This is the kind of story that deserves more attention. If you are discovering this for the first time, and it is shifting the way you think about traditional knowledge, consider hitting like or subscribing. It helps this channel keep going. Now consider what happens when the bread and grain are not enough. Because the calculation is never simple. A family that stores 4 months of grain for 8 people has to account for guests, illness that prevents someone from working and raises caloric needs, animals that must also be fed through winter, and the simple reality that appetites during cold months run higher than during warm ones. The body burns more fuel to maintain warmth. A person doing physical work in sub-zero temperatures needs significantly more food energy than that same person doing the same work in summer. Highland families know this. Their storage calculations are not based on average consumption. They are based on peak consumption, with a buffer. This buffer mentality is visible in every layer of the system. It explains why legumes, particularly lentils and dried chickpeas, play such a central role in Highland Afghan winter food stores. Legumes are dense with calories and protein. They are even easier to store than grain because their lower moisture content at harvest means less preparation is needed before they go into vessels. They also cook faster than whole grains, which matters enormously when fuel is limited. Every gram of dried wood or compressed dung used for cooking has been gathered over months and carries a cost. A food that feeds a family on half the fuel is not just convenient, it is strategic. Dried mulberries deserve their own place in this story. In valleys where mulberry trees grow, the autumn fruit harvest is treated with the same seriousness as grain. Mulberries are spread on flat surfaces and dried until they lose most of their water weight, then stored in cloth sacks. In this form, they last the entire winter and serve multiple roles. They are eaten as a sweet supplement that provides energy and variety in a diet that would otherwise become monotonous. They are fed to children as a concentrated source of sugar and micronutrients during months when fresh food is unavailable. And in certain communities, they are pressed into dense cakes that function almost as an emergency ration, something that can be carried, rationed, and eaten with almost nothing else, and still provide enough energy to keep someone functional. The diversity of stored foods in a well-prepared Highland household is one of the things that surprises researchers when they document these systems in detail. There is typically dried yogurt, formed into hard balls called kurut, that reconstitute in water to create a sour, tangy liquid used both as a flavor agent and as a nutritional supplement. There are dried meats, usually prepared from animals slaughtered in late autumn when the flock must be reduced before the herd cannot be fed through winter, salted heavily and hung in cold, dry spaces to desiccate over weeks. There are dried herbs gathered in summer from alpine meadows, representing flavors but also medicines, because in a sealed winter household, illness is a genuine threat, and the medicinal herbs that grow at high altitude are the only pharmacy available. What becomes clear when you look at all these elements together is that the storage system is not just about calories. It is about maintaining human function across a full biological spectrum through months of isolation. The dried herbs provide micronutrients. The kurut provides fermented cultures that support digestion and immunity. The dried fruit provides sugars when the body needs quick energy. The legumes provide slow-burning protein and complex carbohydrates that regulate energy across a long, cold day. The bread provides the caloric base. Together they form a nutritional architecture that is sophisticated enough that modern nutritionists studying traditional Highland diets have noted that these communities, despite having no formal nutritional education, arrived at remarkably balanced winter macronutrient and micronutrient profiles through lived experience and inherited practice. But all of this stored food is only as good as the space that holds it. And the architecture of Highland Afghan homes is built around the winter storage challenge in ways that most visitors would never notice. The rooms where food is kept are not random. They are positioned in the house to minimize temperature variation. Stone walls, several feet thick, provide thermal mass that absorbs temperature changes slowly and releases them slowly, acting as a buffer between the brutal exterior cold and the stable interior. The orientation of storage rooms relative to the sun matters. North-facing rooms stay cooler and more consistent. Rooms that face south warm too much during the brief winter days and cool too fast at night, creating exactly the oscillation that destroys stored food. These orientations are not accidents of construction. They are choices made by builders who understood, through experience, what happened to food in the wrong room. Ventilation is a separate challenge. Stored grain needs a small amount of air movement to remain healthy. A completely sealed room with no air exchange becomes humid over time as the grain itself releases trace moisture through respiration. But a room with too much airflow loses its thermal stability and can allow humidity from outside to enter during certain weather patterns. The solution is small ventilation openings, sometimes nothing more than gaps left deliberately in the stonework at high points in the wall, positioned so that air moves through from the exterior at a rate just enough to maintain dryness without allowing temperature to destabilize. It is a passive ventilation system that requires no maintenance and no adjustment. The floor of the storage room matters too. Earthen floors can wick moisture upward from the ground, especially in spring as the surrounding soil begins to thaw. Highland builders address this by packing the floor with a layer of gravel below a compressed clay surface, sometimes with flat stones laid on top. The gravel layer allows any rising moisture to disperse before it reaches the clay, and the clay layer acts as a second barrier. Food stored on raised platforms or hanging from wooden beams is protected from floor-level moisture even further. Think about what all of this represents. A family building a home in Badakhshan or Nuristan is not just building shelter. They are building a food preservation machine. Every architectural decision, from the wall thickness to the room orientation to the floor layering to the ventilation gaps, is informed by the single question of whether the food will still be edible in March. The home and the food system are not separate things. They are one integrated survival technology. There is something else that is rarely discussed when people talk about Highland food storage, and it may be the most important part of the entire system: the social layer. A single household storing food in isolation is vulnerable. One bad harvest, one illness that prevents a family from completing their autumn work, one unexpected visitor who stays through the season, and the calculation fails. Highland Afghan communities understood this vulnerability and built around it through a network of mutual obligation that functions almost like a distributed storage system. Grain from good harvests is shared, not given away freely, but exchanged, lent, promised, and tracked through social relationships that carry the weight of survival. A family that had a poor wheat harvest but a good lentil yield will trade with a family whose wheat yield was strong but whose legume crop failed. These exchanges are not charity. They are investments in a network of reciprocal obligation that reduces individual vulnerability across the community. If your storage runs low in March, the social relationship you maintained through shared labor and fair exchange in September may be the thing that keeps your household fed until April. The women who manage these storage systems hold a form of knowledge that is rarely written down and rarely acknowledged by the outside world as what it actually is: expertise. A woman who can assess grain moisture by touch and sound, who knows which herbs to layer and in what quantities, who can calculate how many rounds of dried bread a family of 9 needs to survive 5 months and still have a buffer, who understands which rooms in the house should hold which foods and why, who can read the condition of stored legumes from their color and smell and know whether they will last another 6 weeks or need to be used now. That woman is an engineer. She is practicing a form of applied environmental science that took generations to develop and requires continuous observation and judgment to execute correctly. Modern food preservation science, when it studies these systems, consistently finds that the logic holds up. The moisture control principles match what industrial dry storage facilities use at scale. The use of aromatic compounds as natural pest deterrents has been validated in laboratory conditions. The passive architecture of cold, stable, ventilated storage rooms mirrors the principles behind commercial grain silos. The fermented dairy products used to extend nutritional access through winter align with what microbiologists have learned about how fermentation preserves proteins and beneficial cultures through cold conditions. None of this is coincidence. It is the result of a community running a very long experiment with very high stakes and keeping only what worked. The long nights of the Afghan highland winter are not just long. They are a test. When the temperature outside drops below -20 degrees Celsius, and the only warmth in the house comes from a single small fire, burning compressed fuel that took months to gather, and the only food available is what was prepared before the snow came. Every element of the storage system is either paying off or failing. There is no alternative. There is no delivery, no market, no solution you can buy your way out of. Either the grain was dried correctly, and the bread was made right, and the legumes are still good, and the dried fruit will carry the children through another week of cold, or it is not. The system either holds or it does not. And what is remarkable, what is genuinely worth sitting with, is that these systems held for centuries in some of the most extreme winter conditions inhabited by human beings anywhere on Earth. Not because the people who used them were lucky or extraordinarily tough, but because someone long ago paid very close attention. And then someone else paid attention again and added one more layer of precision. And so on, across generations, until what emerged was a body of knowledge so refined that it could reliably keep a family alive through 5 months of total isolation without wasting a single grain. That is what this was. Not poverty, not primitive subsistence, a system, engineered over time, tested by the hardest possible conditions, and passed down, mostly by women, mostly without fanfare, because the work of keeping people alive through winter was simply what had to be done. The next time you open a refrigerator or place an order for delivery in the middle of a cold night, consider what that ease is built on. Consider who figured out, long before any of that infrastructure existed, how to solve the same problem with stone walls and clay vessels and dried herbs and a ring-shaped sound from a piece of flatbread. The intelligence was always there. We just forgot to look for it. If this story changed how you see traditional knowledge systems, I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other community, food system, traditional dwelling, survival method, or forgotten way of life would you want to explore next? Leave it below, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is a great moment to do it. There are more stories like this one coming, and every one of them hides the same kind of intelligence behind something the modern world stopped paying attention to.